It's 1969, and somewhere in a hospital in Buenos Aires, Argentina, a young American sales representative is watching a surgeon cut into a patient's chest for the third time in 4 years. Same patient, same problem. The pacemaker battery has died again. The little mercury zinc cells that are supposed to keep this person's heart beating have given out after barely 18 months. And now this patient is back on the operating table, chest cracked open, while doctors rush to swap in a fresh unit before it's too late. The sales rep standing in that operating room is a 29-year-old kid from the South Bronx named Manny Villafaña. He doesn't have a college degree. He doesn't have an engineering background. What he does have is a front row seat to one of the most maddening failures in modern medicine. A device that can literally save your life, but only for about a year and a half before it tries to kill you again. And standing there, watching that surgery, Villafaña makes a decision that will change the trajectory of cardiac medicine forever. He is going to fix this. He is going to build a better pacemaker. And he is going to do it with a battery technology so untested, so controversial, that the entire medical establishment will tell him he is out of his mind. He is going to put lithium inside the human heart. In doing so, he will launch a company from a phone booth, burn Medtronic's market dominance to the ground, survive a wave of lawsuits, and create a technology that is still beating inside millions of human chests right now as you listen to this. This is one of the greatest startup stories in American medical history, and almost nobody knows it. You're watching Tech District, where we take apart the companies that built the world of medical technology, down to the circuit board and the engineer who designed it. If that's your kind of story, subscribe and hit like, because the rise here is just as strange as the fall. To understand why Cardiac Pacemakers Inc. mattered, you first have to understand just how broken the world of cardiac pacing was in the 1960s. Because here is a fact that sounds made up, but absolutely is not. Before CPI came along, some of the most brilliant minds in medicine were seriously considering putting plutonium inside people's bodies. Actual nuclear material inside your chest. We will come back to that. The story of the implantable pacemaker begins in 1958 when a Swedish surgeon named Åke Senning implanted the first cardiac pacemaker into a human patient at the Karolinska Hospital in Stockholm. His engineer partner, Rune Elmqvist, had built the device using a rechargeable nickel-cadmium battery. It failed within a few hours. The backup unit lasted about 6 weeks. The patient, a 40-year-old man named Arne Larsson, would go on to receive 26 pacemakers over the course of his life. He outlived both his surgeon and his engineer, dying in 2001 at the age of 86. His heart had been stimulated by pacemakers more than 1 billion times. 26 devices, 26 surgeries, all because the batteries could not keep up with the patient. But 2 years later, in 1960, an American engineer named Wilson Greatbatch changed the game. Greatbatch had accidentally discovered the principle behind the implantable pacemaker while building an oscillator at Cornell University. He grabbed the wrong resistor, plugged it into his circuit, and the device started pulsing. 1.8 milliseconds on, 1 second off, repeating perfectly. The exact rhythm of the human heart. He stared at it and understood immediately what he had built. Greatbatch partnered with a surgeon named William Chardak at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Buffalo, New York, and together they implanted the first successful pacemaker into a human patient in 1960. 10 patients received the device. Patients who would have died within weeks instead lived for years, and in one extraordinary case, more than 3 decades. It was a genuine medical triumph. But there was a problem, a devastating one: the batteries. Every pacemaker of the 1960s ran on mercury zinc cells, the same chemistry originally developed during World War II for military walkie-talkies. One company supplied virtually the entire pacemaker industry. Manufacturers were promised 5 years of battery life. What they actually got was closer to 18 months, sometimes less. And the engineering challenge was maddening. Mercury zinc batteries emitted hydrogen gas as they discharged. That meant the pacemaker casing could not be sealed airtight. It had to be porous, wrapped in epoxy resin, vented to let the gas escape. Which sounds like a reasonable compromise until you remember that this device is sitting inside a human body, surrounded by warm, salty fluids that are constantly trying to seep into anything that is not perfectly sealed. Moisture got in, circuits corroded, batteries shorted out, and when your pacemaker fails, your heart stops receiving the electrical signals it depends on to beat. That is not a warranty claim. That is a life-threatening emergency. Consider what that meant for the patient. You have been told that this miraculous device will regulate your heartbeat and save your life. And it does, for a while. But the clock is ticking from the second the battery is assembled, because the mercury-zinc chemistry starts discharging the moment it is manufactured. A pacemaker that sits on a hospital shelf for 2 months before implantation has already burned through a meaningful chunk of its lifespan before it ever touches a human body. And the worst part is that there is no reliable way to know exactly when the battery is going to die. The voltage stays relatively stable right up until the end, and then it drops off a cliff. No gradual decline, no early warning, just done. Patients were going back under the knife every year, sometimes every 18 months, just to have their batteries swapped. Every surgery carried risk, infection, complications, the general trauma of having your chest opened up again. For young patients who might live with a pacemaker for decades, the math was terrifying. A 30-year-old could be looking at 20 or 30 replacement surgeries over the course of their life. The medical community knew this was unsustainable, and they were getting desperate enough to try some truly wild alternatives. Which brings us back to the plutonium. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, several pacemaker manufacturers, including Medtronic, introduced nuclear-powered models. These devices used a tiny slug of plutonium-238, a radioactive isotope with an 88-year half-life. The decaying plutonium generated heat, which a thermopile converted into electricity. In theory, the battery would outlive the patient. In practice, the devices were enormous, absurdly expensive, required regulatory approval from the Atomic Energy Commission, and came with the minor caveat that when the patient died, the pacemaker had to be surgically removed and shipped to Los Alamos National Laboratory for plutonium recovery. You could not even cremate someone who had one. About 155 nuclear pacemakers were implanted in the United States between 1973 and 1987. Some of them ran flawlessly for over 35 years. One patient in France was reliably paced by a nuclear device for 35 consecutive years before doctors finally decided to replace it with a modern lithium-powered unit, simply as a precaution. For comparison, a standard lithium pacemaker would have required replacement 4 or 5 times over that same period. The nuclear devices were, by any measure, an extraordinary engineering achievement. But they were also heavy, bulky, expensive, and wrapped in layer after layer of shielding to contain the radiation. The hard titanium cases were designed to withstand gunshots and cremation temperatures. As of 2003, an estimated 50 to 100 Americans were still walking around with plutonium-powered pacemakers in their chests. But the idea of putting nuclear material inside millions of heart patients was never going to scale. Everyone knew a better solution had to exist, and it did. It was just hiding inside a battery chemistry that most people thought was too volatile to put inside a human body. Manny Villafaña was not your typical medical device entrepreneur. Born in 1940 in the South Bronx to Puerto Rican immigrant parents, he grew up poor, started working at the Kips Bay Boys and Girls Club at age 9, and handed every penny to his mother. He never went to college. His father and brothers all died of heart disease. And that family history, that personal loss, became the engine that drove everything he did for the rest of his life. In 1964, at 24, Villafaña landed a sales job at Picker International, a medical device exporter based in White Plains, New York. He was a natural. Within a few years, he was handling major accounts, including one that would change his life, Medtronic. the Minneapolis-based company that had licensed Wilson Greatbatch's pacemaker design and dominated the global market with a 65% share. In 1967, Medtronic's legendary co-founder Earl Bakken hired Villafaña away from Picker to become Medtronic's first ever international sales administrator. Villafaña moved to Minneapolis. He spent hours in operating rooms, teaching surgeons how to implant pacemakers, watching patients receive the devices, learning every detail of the technology from the inside out. Then, he spent 2 years in Argentina as Medtronic's Latin American sales manager, and there, far from headquarters, working with hospitals that did not have the luxury of frequent replacement surgeries, he saw the battery problem at its absolute worst. Pacemakers failing without warning, patients dying because their devices gave out where emergency surgery was not immediately available. And then, sometime around 1970, Villafaña ran into Wilson Greatbatch, the man who had invented the implantable pacemaker in the first place. Greatbatch was not just any engineer. He held over 300 patents. He had received the National Medal of Technology and Innovation. He had been inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame, and he was deeply frustrated because the device he had spent his career perfecting was still shackled to a battery technology that was killing people. Greatbatch told Villafaña something remarkable. He had been working on a new type of battery in a rented section of the old Wurlitzer organ factory in North Tonawanda, New York. Not mercury zinc, not nuclear, something entirely different, lithium iodine, and he was looking for someone willing to put it inside a pacemaker. To appreciate why this was such a radical idea, you need to understand what lithium was in 1970. It was the lightest metal on the periodic table, extraordinarily energy dense, and famously reactive. Drop a chunk of lithium in water and it fizzes, sparks, and potentially catches fire. The idea of putting a lithium-based battery inside a human body, surrounded by fluids, sealed inside a chest cavity, struck most engineers and doctors as reckless at best and dangerous at worst. But Greatbatch had figured something out. A lithium iodide cell was a solid-state battery. No liquid electrolyte, no gas emissions. The lithium reacted with iodine to form a thin layer of lithium iodide at the interface, which served as both the electrolyte and the separator. The reaction was slow, controlled, and critically, it produced no gas whatsoever. That meant the entire assembly could be hermetically sealed in a metal casing. No epoxy, no venting, no moisture intrusion. The battery would last 10 years or more. Villafaña was electrified. He went to Medtronic with the idea. They passed. He went to Med General, another device company. They passed too. The established players did not want to bet their reputations on an unproven chemistry that most of the industry considered too risky. So Villafaña decided to bet his own. He had no factory, no investors, no laboratory, no regulatory approval, no clinical data. What he had was conviction, a Rolodex, and an almost unreasonable tolerance for risk. Manny Villafaña believes the greatest pleasure in life is doing the things that people say cannot be done. He was about to prove it. In February 1972, Villafaña stood in a phone booth on the Minneapolis Skyway system and started making calls. He was raising capital for a brand new company, one that would build the world's first lithium-powered pacemaker. He needed $50,000 to get started. He got it. From that phone booth, Cardiac Pacemakers Inc. was born. Villafaña brought in 3 co-founders, all of them former Medtronic colleagues, each bringing a different piece of the puzzle. Anthony Aducci, known as Tony to the people who worked alongside him, was the technical backbone. Born in Chicago in 1937 to an Italian-American family, he had earned a physics degree from St. Mary's University of Minnesota, studied electrical engineering at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and worked at ITT designing digital communication systems before joining Medtronic as its 90th employee. At Medtronic, Aducci had not merely sold pacemakers. He had stood in operating rooms for over 50 surgeries, teaching cardiologists and surgeons the fundamentals of how the devices worked and how to implant them. He understood pacemakers from the circuit board to the chest cavity. Arthur Schwalm brought manufacturing and operational discipline. James Boustert contributed regulatory and engineering knowledge. Together, the four of them had collectively touched every aspect of the pacemaker business during their Medtronic careers. 4 men, $50,000. An office in St. Paul, Minnesota on Hamline Avenue North. And one very big idea. Medtronic was not amused. Lawsuits flew in both directions almost immediately. Medtronic's position was understandable. 4 of their own people had walked out the door and were now building a competing product based on knowledge they had gained while on Medtronic's payroll. CPI's position was equally clear. They were not stealing technology. They were building something Medtronic had explicitly refused to build. Every lawsuit was eventually settled out of court. But the legal battles consumed time, money, and attention that the young company desperately needed for engineering. And yet, despite everything, despite the lawsuits, despite the skepticism, despite a total war chest that would not cover the rent on a decent apartment, they built it. In the spring of 1972, before CPI even had a working prototype, Villafaña was scheduled to travel to France to present the concept to several hospitals. He needed something to show the surgeons. The engineering team carved a block of wood into the approximate shape and size of the pacemaker they were designing, mounted it in a custom presentation case, and Villafaña carried it across the Atlantic like it was the most valuable object on Earth. That block of wood now sits in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. The brass plate on the case reads, CPI's first demo used in France, spring 1972. But the demo was a placeholder. The real thing came next, and it came fast. CPI's pacemaker was a work of elegant engineering. The lithium iodide cell provided a compact, reliable power source with an energy density that dwarfed anything mercury zinc could offer. It was smaller than the devices Medtronic was selling, and it contained a more efficient hybrid circuit that reduced power consumption even further. But the real breakthrough was the casing. The entire device was enclosed in a hermetically sealed metallic enclosure, polished, smooth, impervious to body fluids. The surface was polished metal with a specialized zone through which the external electrode leads passed in a sealed relationship, maintaining the hermetic integrity of the whole unit. No epoxy, no venting, no hydrogen gas, no moisture creeping in to corrode the electronics. For the first time in the history of cardiac pacing, the battery, the circuitry, and the casing worked together as a single sealed system that the human body simply could not penetrate. The battery did not just last longer, it was fundamentally more predictable. Mercury zinc cells would maintain a steady voltage right up until the moment they died, giving doctors essentially no warning before failure. Lithium iodide cells, by contrast, showed a gradual, measurable increase in internal impedance as they depleted. For the first time, doctors could actually monitor the remaining battery life and schedule a replacement before the device failed. That alone was a breakthrough. In June 1973, the first heart patient received a CPI pacemaker. The surgery was successful, the device worked, and it kept working. Not for 18 months, not for 2 years, for years on end. The lithium iodide chemistry delivered exactly what Great Batch had promised and what Villafaña had believed. And then the market moved, and it moved fast. Within 2 years, CPI had sold approximately 8,500 pacemakers. This was a company that did not exist in 1971. By the mid-1970s, they were one of the most talked about startups in the medical device industry. Sales climbed from zero to over $47 million. Medtronic, the giant, the incumbent, the company that had essentially created the pacemaker market, watched its market share collapse from 65% to 35% in a freefall that stunned Wall Street. And here is the painful irony for Medtronic. While CPI was eating their lunch with lithium technology, Medtronic was still selling the Zytron, a pacemaker powered by the very mercury-zinc batteries that everyone now knew were obsolete. In 1975, some of those Zytron units began shorting out after implantation due to moisture leaks. Medtronic had to recall 2,377 pacemakers. No patients died, but the reputational damage was severe. The Zytron debacle shook Medtronic to its foundation. By 1980, earnings were declining and leadership was in crisis. Earl Bakken, the co-founder who had built the company from a converted boxcar garage in 1949, had stepped down as president. A new CEO, Winston Wallen, came in to rebuild, and one of his first priorities was pivoting, finally, to lithium battery technology. Medtronic eventually launched a new generation of programmable pacemakers and began clawing back market share. But they were playing catch-up now. The company that had invented the commercial pacemaker industry was following the trail that 4 of its own former employees had blazed. By 1978, nearly every pacemaker manufacturer on the market had switched to lithium batteries. The technology that Medtronic, Med-General, and the rest of the establishment had dismissed as too risky had become the universal standard in less than 6 years. CPI had not just introduced a better product. They had rewritten the rules of the entire industry. Therefore, the question became what to do with that success. By early 1978, CPI had a problem that most startups would kill for. They were too successful to stay small, but too vulnerable to stay independent. Sales had rocketed past $47 million, but the company's stock price was behaving like a roller coaster, swinging from $33 a share down to $11 in a single year. Some suspected the stock was being shorted. Others attributed the volatility to the natural risk profile of a one-product company. And that was the real vulnerability. CPI had one product, one brilliant, world-changing product, but still just one. The founders knew they needed to diversify. They could try to acquire other medical device companies, or they could find a larger partner to acquire them. They chose the latter. Several suitors came calling, but Eli Lilly, the pharmaceutical giant based in Indianapolis, was the most enthusiastic. The fit made sense on paper. Lilly had deep research pockets, cardiovascular drug expertise, and a shared interest in developing insulin pumps. CPI had a proven cardiac device platform and a team that had already transformed one industry. As Anthony Adducci later recalled, at CPI, they had not been able to dedicate the dollars and time necessary to develop new products beyond their staple lithium-powered pacemaker. Lilly was a $2 billion company with tremendous resources, especially in research and development. Negotiations took place over months. Numerous flights between Minneapolis and Indianapolis. Meetings brokered by Piper, Jaffray, and Hopwood's corporate finance department. The final deal was hammered out at a motel in suburban Bloomington, Minnesota. CPI's negotiation team included Adducci, Schwalm, and outside advisors Tom King and Hunt Green. In December 1978, Eli Lilly and Company acquired Cardiac Pacemakers Inc. for $127 million. $127 million for a company that was 6 years old. Founded with $50,000 raised from a phone booth. But the CPI story did not end with that acquisition. Under Lilly's ownership, CPI continued to innovate, expanding into defibrillators, programmable devices, and new cardiac rhythm management technologies. The St. Paul operation grew into one of the most important cardiac device centers in the world, eventually employing thousands. In 1994, Lilly spun off its medical device businesses into a new company called Guidant Corporation with CPI at its core. Guidant went public and became a powerhouse in cardiovascular devices, manufacturing and selling pacemakers and defibrillators in nearly 100 countries. In December 2004, Johnson & Johnson announced it was acquiring Guidant for $25.4 billion. But the deal fell apart after reports of defibrillator failures and a bidding war erupted. Boston Scientific stepped in, and in April 2006, completed its acquisition of Guidant for $27 billion, creating one of the largest medical technology companies in the world. $27 billion. From a phone booth in the Minneapolis Skyway to $27 billion, the technology that Villafaña and his three co-founders had staked their careers on, the lithium iodide pacemaker battery, was now inside virtually every cardiac pacing device on the planet. Meanwhile, Villafaña was not done. Not by a long shot. In 1976, before CPI was even acquired, he had already moved on to his next venture, founding St. Jude Medical and developing the bileflet mechanical heart valve that became the most commonly used prosthetic heart valve in the world, implanted in approximately 5 million patients. Abbott Laboratories eventually bought St. Jude Medical for $25 billion. Villafaña then founded ATS Medical, which was acquired by Medtronic, the very company he had left to start CPI, for $370 million. He went on to found Kips Bay Medical, then Medical 21. 8 startups in total, 7 of them taken to IPO. As of his mid-80s, he was still at his desk in Plymouth, Minnesota, surrounded by a museum-like collection of the old pacemakers he had helped make obsolete. Anthony Adducci, the quiet physicist who co-invented the lithium pacemaker and taught surgeons how to implant it, passed away in September 2006 at the age of 69 in Scottsdale, Arizona. He is buried at Resurrection Cemetery in Mendota Heights, Minnesota, not far from the St. Paul offices where CPI began. His name does not appear in most histories of cardiac pacing. The textbooks credit Greatbatch for the battery, Villafaña for the business, and Medtronic for the industry. Adducci was the engineer in the room, the one who understood both the circuit and the chest cavity, the one who bridged the gap between what the battery could do and what the surgeon needed. The lithium iodide pacemaker he helped create has since saved millions of lives. He did not live to see the $27 billion acquisition. He did not need to. Here is what stays with me about this story. It is not the technology, although the technology is genuinely brilliant. It is not the money, although the financial arc from $50,000 to $27 billion is staggering. It is something simpler than that. The entire pacemaker industry, Medtronic, every established player, every boardroom full of engineers and executives, looked at the lithium battery and said no. Too risky. Too unproven. Too dangerous. And 4 former employees of the very company that led the market said, actually, we think you are wrong. And we are willing to bet everything on it. They were right. The engineers built it, the patients proved it, and the industry that had said no spent the next decade scrambling to catch up. Cardiac Pacemakers Inc. invented the lithium pacemaker, proved the lithium pacemaker, and forced an entire industry to adopt the lithium pacemaker, and then the company disappeared into the belly of a pharmaceutical giant before most people ever learned its name. Today, lithium iodide cells power virtually every implantable cardiac pacemaker on Earth. The technology that CPI pioneered in a small office in St. Paul, Minnesota, in the early 1970s is the standard. Not an alternative, not a niche application. The standard. More than 600,000 pacemakers are implanted worldwide every year, and the vast majority of them run on descendants of the battery chemistry that Wilson Greatbatch envisioned and Cardiac Pacemakers Inc. brought to life. The nuclear pacemakers are gone. The mercury-zinc batteries are museum artifacts. The epoxy casings that let moisture destroy circuits from the inside out are relics of a less elegant age. What is left is something that works, something that lasts, something that a kid from the South Bronx believed was possible when everyone else said it was not. Over 3 million people are walking around right now with pacemakers in their chests. More than 600,000 new ones are implanted every year. A device that once required surgery every 18 months now hums along quietly for a decade or more, powered by the same fundamental chemistry that CPI brought to market in 1973. The lithium iodide cell that Greatbatch designed and that Adducci and Villafaña built into a working product has become so ubiquitous, so reliable, so thoroughly standard, that most cardiologists today have never even seen a mercury zinc pacemaker outside of a textbook. Most of those patients do not think about the device at all, which is of course the whole point. The best medical technology is the kind you forget is there. But somebody had to build it first. Somebody had to stand in a phone booth in the Minneapolis Skyway, dial for dollars, hire 3 friends, survive the lawsuits, ignore the skeptics, and put lithium inside the human heart. And that is exactly what they did. If you owned a pacemaker, worked on one, or worked at CPI, Medtronic, Guidant, or Boston Scientific during any of the years we covered today, drop a comment below. Tell us the model, the year, and whether it still works. The people who use these devices and the people who built them know more about what was lost and what was saved than anyone who sold them ever will. Subscribe to Tech District because we have the story of another medical technology company coming next, and you will not want to miss how it ends.